All right, welcome to episode 5 of Talk Data to Me with myself, Craig Stewart, off the back of a pretty awesome week at DataFest last week. And one of the companies that joined us there was Calybre, who actually hosted our speaker experience cooking thing at the cookery, which was amazing. I didn't go. I left it to the team, but loads of fun was had there. And then joining me from Calybre is Dillon Mantle, who's the engagement lead there. Dillon, thanks for joining us. How's it going?
Yeah, good. Thanks, Craig. It's good to be here. It's been a bit of a whirlwind over the last month or so, but yeah, lots of fun.
Yeah, awesome. So you're quite new at Calybre, right?
Yeah, so I joined at the beginning of May. I was previously at a large bank. I was head of data and AI, but decided I thoroughly enjoyed consulting. And I've worked with Alexa and the Calybre leadership before.
Yeah.
So I decided to take a bit of a dive into data startup.
Yeah, awesome, exciting times. And having spent some time with you and Alexa and the rest of the team, really is a very cool company. I love the slogan, the tagline, really awesome data people, which is just such a refreshing, honest, cool way of saying what you do, I guess.
No, it is. And I think, data is about people.
Yeah.
It's not about the technology. I've been in data for a long time, and things that I was doing in 2005 on SQL Server 2000, we're still doing in Databricks. So I think you're really focusing on the people and the skills is going to be our market differentiator.
Yeah. All right. Good stuff. Well, if anybody wants to find out more about Calybre, chat to Dillon, look them up, LinkedIn, etc. I'm sure they'll happily come and have a conversation and a coffee with you guys. All right, Dillon, we're going to be talking about enterprise architecture, the future of enterprise architecture. I mean, obviously, it's not a new subject. It's not a new topic. It's not a new sort of way of doing things. But I'd imagine that there's quite a bit sort of evolution at the moment, which we'll get into later on. Maybe you could just give us your sort of brief overview of what enterprise architecture is all about, because it's a fairly big thing. There's data architecture, enterprise architecture. What is your sort of spin on it?
So enterprise architecture, it's much like, when you go build your house, right? You've got to have a plan of what you're trying to build. You don't necessarily need to know how. It's really just around what are you trying to do. And it's essentially a holistic approach to the planning, the design, the implementation, and the governance of enterprises' information architecture. It's essentially a strategic blueprint to guide the organization in its journey. I like to say, when you go present sort of a vision, everybody's like, oh, how much is it going to cost? What are the timelines? I prefer to think of it as, if we agree on this architecture, every decision that we take from today will be a step closer to that end state. But it doesn't mean you go immediately reinvent the wheel with your legacy systems. It just means that when you get the budget to go reinvest in them, you know where you're going to go put that component, and you know how you're going to build it. When we look at it from a data perspective, I think it becomes quite interesting because data touches, we talk data, everybody thinks analytics and AI, but I've still got to get data from system A to system B. And all too often, you'll have a system that emails a CSV file around. You'll then have another system that sends an XML file around. Well, why do we have two systems? Let's have one system to send all files around, and we could have another system maybe to send message queues around. And the architecture is around how do we get efficient at these things? How do we set the business up for success in the future? And how do we start simplifying what we do so that we can better respond to what the business is trying to do? If you've got 5 different integration methodologies and the business comes to you and says, hey, we want to go run an experiment on our data, more often than not, you can't get to the data because nobody knows where it sits or it's too big, you don't know where to put it. And by the time you get to running the experiment that the business is looking for, the opportunity has passed. Whereas if you've got sort of a vision of what you're trying to do, everybody's actively working towards that. When you get these opportunities, hopefully everything's in place and you can respond far quicker to the business than what you would have been able to do previously.
Yeah. So it strikes me, you kind of say that you need this view of what you want. Obviously, the architectures, it's not something I assume that can be pushed from, people looking after enterprise architecture onto the business. It doesn't sort of operate in a vacuum. It's got to really align to the strategic sort of intent of the organization, I guess, also with the data strategy, all that sort of thing. And with that, I would assume comes a lot of sort of change management as well.
I think a lot of what we do in technology is around change management. And I think the biggest challenge that you tend to have with data architectures in general is everybody's got an opinion. People work in Excel, people work in SQL, some people like Snowflake, some people like Databricks, whatever the case may be. And you've got to get people to buy into that vision. Once people buy into that vision, you can then start putting a logical roadmap together. Hey, if we're going to move off SQL into NoSQL, these are the use cases where we're going to move over. That way, that when the business starts playing back requirements that they have, you at least understand what change is required, and you can have that conversation up front. And I think where a lot of organizations, and as data professionals, and I think we fall foul, is we work directly with the business unit, and we're not necessarily taking the time to understand what the organization is trying to do. So you might have a vendor coming in pushing a product to solve an individual business's issue, but that product might actually be contributing to the large challenge that the organization is having. And I think taking the time to understand where the business is going, taking the time to understand what architecturally technology teams are trying to do, helps you better position that product that you're trying to land, and thereby helps you have a good change governance and really constructive conversations around like how will you enable this technology.
Yeah. And how do you get people to buy into the vision? Obviously, it's sort of their requirement. We need to launch X product into the business so that they want it. But how do you get them to buy into the vision where I'd imagine, large parts of people within business don't understand the technical side of enterprise architecture. They may be a little bit sort of scared off by the jargon and the technical side of these things. How do you get them to buy into the vision rather than just, well, you guys are the tech team, you get it done, you know what we need? Like, is there sort of like, I wouldn't say friction, but do they need to buy into the vision? You just need to say, I get it, we'll get it done, don't worry how.
No, so I think where architecture generally struggles is, as you mentioned, it's kind of a them and us, where actually it's not, right? Architecture is there to make your life easier. And much like building a house, right? You're not going to go to the architect and say, design me a house. You're going to sit with the architect. You're going to say, hey, I want this. I want a pool. I need a garage for 3 cars. I need a workshop, or whatever the case may be. You give the logical requirement, and then the architect goes away and figures out how best to do that. And I think the most successful projects that I've seen, the strong business buy-in is there from the start, right? So, change is driven by the business. It's funded by the business, and they need to drive that journey. I think if you come as an outsider, as you put it, and you say to the business, you will do it this way, that's where you start having the challenges. So it is a bit of give and take. Business needs to understand that actually, yes, we do need the architecture, but they also need to acknowledge that they drive it in the sense of requirements. And then architecture teams need to understand that they are essentially order takers from the business, and their job is to make sure that they can construct the business in a manner that enables the business to grow and thrive.
Yeah. Okay. You talk a lot there about, I guess, speed and not missing the moment. I think in today's business world, everything needs to be done, as close to real time as possible. Your competitors are going to get ahead of you if you don't get, the decision model or whatever it is into the business really quickly. How does enterprise architecture help with that speed, the agility, innovation, cost optimization, all those sorts of things? Because maybe some people think it's just a very standard sort of thing, but maybe they don't realize how agile it can be and how it can sort of aid innovation.
Yeah, so I think one of the key points for, I think, many people to understand is that architectures are not static, right? So as technology changes, as computers speed up, the architecture should change.
Yeah.
But then looking at it logically, if you follow a modular approach, so, touching on what I said earlier, is that if I've got a system that's shipping files around, we know that files are not going to be real time, right? And if you know that data is only available like in a bulk file, and the business comes to you and says, hey, we really want to have real time analytics on that, you can have a constructive conversation up front to say, but actually it's not possible. However, we've got this message bus capability. If we change the source system to expose this data in a slightly different manner. We've got the ability then to consume the data closer to real time, and then we can go enable your capability off that. And that's where sort of the architecture thinking comes in, because you consider the now, but you're building for the future. So, you know, a lot of it is around placeholders of where you want to be. It's not necessarily what you have in place today, so that when you sit with the business and they say, can you build this thing for me? You almost have the answer at hand, and you can have the constructive conversation up front.
Yeah. All right, perfect. So I think it's a good segue into sort of, you know, the future of enterprise architecture. So you're building for the future. I think things are moving so rapidly at the moment in terms of technology. Obviously, come from an AI background at one of the big banks. That is just something that I think is almost like a J curve, or a sort of hockey stick type curve at the moment. It's just moving so quickly. How does enterprise architecture keep up with that, manage that, make sure that it gets into place really well? I know you talk about things like data quantity and velocity, and that sort of thing is just exponentially growing. How does enterprise architecture help manage that sort of just deluge of data?
So I think it's in the data realm, it's quite interesting, because all the new technologies that have come out have largely built on previous technologies. There's nothing really that replaces what was there before. You know, so in the 1970s, we had relational database systems. So, you know, normal SQL database, Postgres. Then in the 1990s, we moved to data warehousing. And essentially, data warehousing ran on SQL, but it just structured the data slightly differently. You know, but then we realized, you know, we need to go store documents or NoSQL. Right? It didn't replace your relational databases. It was, here's a problem that we haven't solved. Here's a technology to solve it. And that subsequently moved into your big data, your cloud storage, and your data lakes, which is really just now doing that same thing at scale at a significantly lower cost. With the current paradigm really around sort of your lake houses, moving into the data mesh and data fabric paradigms. And I think we're lucky in the data architectures that these things have built on top of each other. And I think from an architectural perspective is that if you understand the fundamentals, right? So I've got structured data, I've got unstructured data, I've got fast data, I've got slow data, I've got scenarios where I need to do real-time analytics because I need to see if my system stability is there so that I don't get frustrated customers, or actually, you know, this can be slow data because it's, you know, it's a month-end regulatory report. If you get those building blocks in place and you understand the velocity, the veracity, and the volume of your data and sort of why it is that way, when the new technologies come along, or when the opportunities come there to leverage the data that you've got to serve a business need, you logically understand the technology problem, and you can focus on solving the business problem in the context of how the business is currently operating. Whereas if you don't really have any strategy around that, what tends to happen is the business needs data. They get the data from where they've got access to it, right? So it could be from an email, it could be from a CSV file that somebody's populated manually. And the business moves fast, but then you start having issues with system stability, and, you know, system A doesn't have the same number as system B. And then it's very, very expensive to fix that. So I think sort of having that vision of where you're wanting to go, understanding sort of the complexities around data and around, you know, what is big data, what is structured data, what is unstructured data, and planning for that puts you in a better position to respond to what the business is asking for.
How do you peer into the future further ahead? I mean, it's very hard to kind of understand what's going to be coming up next, and what sort of time horizon do you typically look at? I mean, and who's kind of looking at that? Is it a 6-month thing? Is it 12 months? Is it 5, 10 years? And how do you and I like how you say you kind of build with the future in mind, but how do you know what the future is going to ultimately look like? That the context and the sort of, I guess, the structure of the house might need to change to incorporate, you know, very different things that may come up in 5 or 10 years time.
Yeah. So I think this is where, you know, architecture is a lot about having conversations. It's a very iterative process. You don't form an opinion and that is the standard for the next 5 years. You form an opinion, you test the opinion, you discuss with people, you understand the business more, and you evolve that opinion over time. So I think one of the key things that need to happen is a lot of conversation. And it's a lot of conversation internally with obviously your client and the business, but it's also around looking up at what the market's doing. I think in today's age, with social media, YouTube videos, partner conference every second month, I think a key part is to go attend these things, to listen to what the keynotes are, to have a look at what the technical demos are, and actually also to play with technology. I think some of the most successful architects that I've worked with, they'll do development, they go do architecture. They go do development, they go do architecture. So they're kind of always evolving their skill set. So I don't think it's not necessarily 2, 3, 4 years down the line. I think at the moment we're looking 6, 12 months down the line. If we look at the vendors like Snowflake, Databricks, Microsoft with their Fabric ecosystem, they're almost releasing new capability every week. So you've got to keep looking at the market. You've got to keep talking to people, but you've also got to keep looking within your business and just making sure that, hey, is the position that I put down together last month, a year ago, 2 years ago, still valid given how the market is changing? And if you don't think it's valid, then start testing it. Go write some code, go test using ChatGPT, go test Copilot or GitHub Copilot, and see how this thing works, and then form an opinion off that experimentation.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily the architect that does that. Yeah. The architect might work with technical teams. So a lot of businesses have digital teams these days. So the architects, good architects should build relationships with these teams so that they can get the insights from the experimentation that those teams are doing.
Yeah. And what's your thoughts on digital twins? So having a digital twin of the business and sort of using that iterative testing process in a sort of almost simulated environment rather than hypothesizing, what may happen if you did this.
Look, I think with the technologies that we have available to us today, if the business has the funding and the capacity to do it, I definitely think it's worth running a digital twin where possible. But I don't think many businesses have that luxury. Right now, if you look at the world economy, there's a lot of cost pressure across the board. And I think, where you can run the digital twin, absolutely, by all means, go do it. But I don't think the digital twin is going to replace having a cup of tea with somebody, really understand the problem. Because even if you have the digital twin and you don't have that conversation, what are you testing? What is your hypothesis? What is the outcome that you're looking for? And I think, where architecture potentially fails is not at a technology level, it's at a communication level. What is the business trying to do? Do I really understand the business objectives? And am I able to articulate that clearly back to the business so they understand what I'm trying to do? Technology is essentially secondary.
All right, cool. I think, it just sort of popped into my head, but I think it's obviously a very big undertaking. All right, let's maybe just go back a little bit. You mentioned earlier about data mesh versus data fabric. Do you do one or the other? Do you do both? What situations does that particularly work in? Because I've heard a lot of people kind of talk about, especially data mesh, and be like, it's a nice idea, but is it really achievable? Doesn't get the results you're looking. Maybe just unpack that a little, like data fabric versus data mesh. What works when, and for what type of organization, I guess.
Yeah. So I think where the waters initially get murky is the vendors have now cottoned onto data mesh and fabric, and they're producing products and something that is more a process or an idea than a physical thing. Right. So I think, when I discuss, when people raise this question with me, I always like, do you mean technology or do you mean process? So I think that's the first stepping stone, just make sure people understand what it is. And I think from a data mesh perspective, it is an approach. It is not a technology. And it is an approach that says, how do we enable teams that are different maturities to go deliver to the business's objectives in a unified manner, right? So you wouldn't have two people building out a single view of customer. That should be driven by a single team, right? So, there's a level of maturity that is required for data mesh, but there is a large level of autonomy, whereas and that tends to suit more decentralized organizations, right? So, if you're a large organization that's a multinational, you've got different laws all over the show, a data mesh makes sense at a country level. It doesn't mean you don't need to go produce a single view of what your business looks like. It just means that you acknowledge that, hey, in an African country, I might have to run an on-prem server, where in Europe market, I might be able to go run something in the cloud. And that leads to a whole bunch of different sort of technology challenges and ways that we implement things and manage our data. Absolutely, great step forward. When we think of data fabric, it is really around having a set of services that present the data in a unified manner, regardless of what's happening behind the scenes, right? So you might have a scenario where, very simplistically, I'm running SQL technology A and I'm running SQL technology B. And the business person's like, well, I don't care that you've got two separate technologies. I want a single place to get my data. So how do you go present that data in a unified manner to the user whilst abstracting the complexity under the hood?
Yeah.
So when you look at data mesh is really around a way of operating, and that way of operating might result in separate technologies that are achieving the outcome required for the business. And then data fabric potentially could sit on top of that to say, okay, well, how do we take these segmented approaches and expose it to the business in a unified manner? So that might be more of a hybrid approach, where an organization might say, we're going to have a centralized data team. We've got very strong data governance. We're going to have one single team presenting our data to users. That would be a very much a fabric approach, with very little sort of autonomy within the areas. But the technologies at the moment, if you look at something like Microsoft Fabric, you can run a data mesh paradigm like at a logical level. At a technical level, it is a fabric because it's one set of technologies, but then you can expose that technology in a manner that is segmented across the business. Which is coming back to what I said earlier, is we should think of these things more of a way of work. Do we want to centralize our governance? Do we not want to centralize our governance? What do we centralize? What do we not centralize? And I think a nice way of looking at it is, if we create a single view of the customer, right, for a large organization, that logically should probably be centralized. But if I go to another part of the business, they might have a slightly nuanced view of that. So give them the autonomy to create that nuanced view, but off the centralized view. So you've really got to understand how the business operates, understand the maturity of the various units within the business, and then kind of do something that makes sense for the business. I think the key message here is everything we do in data, architecturally at a technical level, is driven by whatever the business requires. And we need to sort of position an appropriate response to the problems that they've got.
Yeah. And is it sort of the method that you choose, the approach that you choose, is it sort of a moment in time type thing? So as the business evolves, changes, etc., you can kind of change back from mesh into a different sort of architecture. Is it sort of that fluid that it needs to be fit for purpose at the time? Was it sort of once you've locked into that, it's very hard to kind of sort of repeal what you've decided to do?
So I think it lies with the maturity of the teams within the business, right? So if I look at, let's say I implement a single centralized approach. So we run a single warehouse for the entire business. At some point, I need to carve up that view for the business lines, right? So there is always like a logical segmentation of these things. So I think it would be significantly easier to go from a centralized approach to a decentralized approach, because it's usually easier to break things up. Whereas if you're on a mesh approach where I'm going to say it's a free for all, right? So division A can use technology A, division B can use technology B, division C can go use something like completely different. It is going to be very difficult to tie those things back together. But there are technologies that enable this. So if you look at the data virtualization companies like Denodo or the open source version Dremio, I can have a completely decentralized approach. As a business, we decide it's not working. We can centralize that, put a layer, an obfuscation layer in front of the business user, centralize the output, and then slowly but surely change the back end. But it is going to be hellishly expensive. I think personally, I think the more centralized the organization is, the more immature it is with data. where when you start moving towards a more mesh paradigm where things are starting to be decentralized, those tend to be a lot more mature organizations within their data journey. So generally speaking, you'd probably go from a centralized approach to a hybrid approach.
Okay, cool. And to continue that train of thought as we get towards the end of this conversation, what are some of the decision considerations people should have when choosing the right architecture, or the architecture that's right for their business? Because I guess there's no one right architecture, right? It's the architecture that's right for your business. What are some of like maybe 3 or 4 key things people should consider?
Yeah, so I think the biggest one that I've dealt with quite regularly across a number of industries is really, how does the business structure itself? You know, if the business is a highly segmented structure, very strong silos, it is going to be very difficult to go position a centralized data capability. Whereas if the business is a lot more sort of flat, it is a lot easier conversation to have a more decentralized approach to working with the data. There's obviously a very big consideration around data governance. So if you're working in a heavily regulated environment such as financial services or government services, you know, there are elements of that you would definitely want to centralize. And then I think agility is a very big thing that teams need to consider. When you centralize things, it tends to be a lot more difficult to respond quickly. You know, what tends to happen then is somebody will, and I've seen this so many times, somebody uses their credit card and goes and builds something outside the company, which is great initially, but then you've got to bring this thing back in. You know, so if the business has this desire to be agile in the sense of how they create products, you need to make sure that you structure your platforms for that. A really good example I can think of is if you compare the likes of Discovery Bank or Discovery as a business to your more traditional financial services, right? You know, Discovery are able to respond far quicker to a new product than a traditional bank might be able to have. But you know, not to criticize them, that does present challenges for them. You know, if you engage with the banks frequently and you use their banking apps, you will see the difference experience that you get from maybe a Discovery banking app to maybe an ABSA banking app. You know, so the business has to decide and make trade-offs with regards to how agile they want to be.
All right. Last question. In conclusion, what was your one piece of advice to people listening to this as they kind of decide their future state of architecture within their business?
I think the key thing is to really take the time to understand what the business is trying to do. The technology is definitely second. Good technology is not going to solve a bad process. And I think where we've had real good successes through my career, we've always had very, very strong business buy-in, very strong decision-making from the business. But the technology and architecture teams have listened to what the business has requested.
Awesome. Good final lesson there. Dillon, thanks so much for joining me. It's been enlightening and interesting. Not being a super technical person myself, I found that actually really easy to kind of understand. And I think that's sort of the value that you bring, right? Is being able to just put it into a language that people will understand across business, which I think is great. So yeah, thanks so much.
Great. Thank you, Craig.
All right. Chat soon. Bye.
Cheers.